All right, so we're starting our next chapter now, which is on community and ecosystem ecology. And this chapter, to be honest, is going to be a fairly long one because I think, as I mentioned before, normally in most textbooks, these two topics, both community and ecosystem ecology, typically get their own chapter. So it's going to be a pretty large amount of information we're seeing in this chapter, which is why we have so much time set aside for it on the syllabus. If you take a look, there's like 4 days set aside for it. So first off, we're going to start with community ecology. Once we get through that, we'll eventually transition then into ecosystem ecology. But before we do that, I want to make sure we understand again what a community is. And so communities in a biological context are groups of all of the species in a given place at a given time. So it's not just one species, it's every single species in the same place at the same time. So it's going to include any bacteria that might be around, any animals or plants or fungi or protists that might be around. It's going to be all of those organisms together in the same place at the same time. And so when we have multiple organisms living together in the same place at the same time, there creates a potential for species interactions to occur, right? So we can see eventually here in a second, we're going to start talking about things like mutualism and competition and commensalism and predation, and we're going to go through each one of those kind of section by section. But before we do that, I want to talk just really broadly about how communities are, how they're measured, and how they're described. So, the first thing that we use to describe the overall structure of a community is the richness of that community. And that simply refers to how many species there are in that community. More commonly, even than that, is the measure of biodiversity, which takes into account not only how many species there are, but how evenly distributed those species are. So is a community dominated by one really super abundant species, or are they pretty well evenly distributed throughout the community for all the species? Um, the second measure that we use to describe communities is productivity, and especially productivity in the sense of what we call primary productivity, which is where we take a look at how much plant biomass is produced in a given area in a given unit at a time. So you might say, okay, well, there's 10,000 kilograms of plant biomass produced per hectare per year or whatever. It's a measure of how much biomass is made in a given amount of time in a given area of land. And it can be used not only for plants, but any sort of photosynthetic thing. Any producer, cyanobacteria, algae, plants, they all kind of do sort of the same thing. They're the base of the food web, and so we can look at them in terms of how much biomass they add to the system in any given amount of time. The other big thing, of course, that we're going to see are the interactions that can have tremendously important effects for the adaptations of species, evolutionary processes, driving extinctions, perhaps even driving radiations of species into new species. So we'll take a look at that as well. Historically, there were really two main ways of looking at a community. One of them was called the individualistic concept, which was sort of the idea that species show up in the same place at the same time and more or less are uh, not really part of anything greater than just a group of species. So, in other words, you could take a species out of a community, plug in some other similar species, and that community would work just fine. So, in other words, in this case, the individualistic part of things means that species are in it for themselves. The second concept was called the holistic concept, which is the idea that communities are aggregations of species, and they have to be specifically the species that are in that community. You can't take out any one species and put something else in and still expect the community to stay the same forever. And so there was a period of time, several decades, where there was a bit of an argument over which one of these two might be a more accurate picture of what actually goes on in a biological community. It turns out we think now it's the first one because we see situations all the time where you might see a local extinction of some species, but very quickly some other species moves in and kind of picks up the slack and takes over the role or the niche of the species that was lost. So you don't actually have to have specific species in place. As long as you have things that do the jobs of those species, that community will be just fine. All right, so we can look at distribution of species as well. A lot of times you'll see in communities the species places where species richness is the highest are places that we call ecotones. So if we take a look at this graph here, we have different species of plants growing on different types of soil. So we have normal soil, we have serpentine soil, and then we have kind of a gradient in between where normal transitions into serpentine. And if you actually go through here and count the species that just occur in normal soil, there actually aren't any. If you count the number of species that just occur on serpentine soil, there's a couple of really just one specialist, maybe two. Fireweed and knotweed are both specialists on serpentine soil. But everybody else, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 other species occur in one of these other two habitats and the area in between. So we see a lot of species in this transition zone between the other two habitats. So we want to look at interactions between species, right? So if you have two species that are in the same place at the same time, we can look at how they affect each other in terms of whether they have a positive effect on each other, a negative effect on each other, or maybe even no effect on each other. And so these are what we call symbioses. Symbioses are where you have two organisms that live together in some sort of relatively close-knit association. So in this case, this first interaction here, we have species 1 that's benefited by species 2, and species 2 that's benefited by species 1. So it's a win-win situation. And when we have that, we have what's called a mutualism. If we have a situation where species 1 is benefited by species 2, but 2 is neither harmed nor helped by species 1, we would call that a commensalism. So it's a win-neutral association between two species. And we'll see some examples of those as well, although the real examples of that is actually kind of hard to come by. We can also see situations where we have a win-lose association. So species 1 is benefited by 2, and species 2 is negatively impacted by species 1. So you might think about predation or parasitism or maybe even herbivory as being we call an exploitative association. One species is taking advantage of the other species. There is a theoretical one called an amensalism where species 1 is hurt by species 2 and species 2 is neither harmed nor helped by species 1, but this, in biologically meaningful terms, is not really that common of a thing, and we don't even really talk about this one that much because it doesn't appear to show up that much, if ever, in nature. The last one here is a lose-lose association where both species have a negative effect on each other, and so the most, obvious example that you might think of with this one would be competition. Both species have some negative impact on each other, so we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about competition too. But for right now, we're going to talk about mutualism. Right? This is your win-win association. Both species are benefited by the presence of the other species. A lot of times you'll find that people will use the terms symbiosis and mutualism interchangeably. That's not technically correct because there are other types of symbiosis aside from mutualism. Mutualism is the only one where both species are benefited by each other. So we're going to look at a few examples here. We have mycorrhizae, mycorrhizal fungi, which are associations between plant roots and certain types of fungi. There are lichens, which are associations between fungi and algae. And corals, which are associations between animals and algae. So we have all these different groups of organisms that interact with each other and they benefit each other. And there's another one on this slide over here, actually. We have a bat that's pollinating a cactus. So that would be another win-win association. The cactus is getting pollen spread from this plant to another plant, and the bat is getting reward in terms of nectar for coming to that flower. So both parties are benefited by the presence of the other one. With mycorrhizal fungi, this again is your association. The name mycorrhiza literally means fungus root. So we have fungi that grow in and around the roots of something like 90 to 95% of all plants have this association. It's incredibly abundant. Again, this is win-win. So in this case, the plant is actually getting three things from the fungus. It's getting increased water uptake, it's getting increased phosphorus uptake, and it's getting protection from root pathogens. So three pretty big advantages for the plant in having this association with the fungi. On the other hand, we also have, for the fungus, an advantage. Plants are obviously really good at making carbohydrates. They do that photosynthetic process. They can make lots and lots of glucose. And as we know, fungi are heterotrophic. They cannot manufacture their own glucose. They have to get it from a source. So what they're going to do is to siphon off some of the carbohydrates from the plant and use that for themselves. So the fungus is getting food, and the plant is getting water and nutrients like phosphorus and protection from other nastier kinds of fungi. It's a win-win association. Corals are a case where we have animals that are associating with algae, and probably the best picture of that is this bottom left picture where we have these kind of like sort of upside down jellyfish looking things here with tentacles. These are coral animals. They are related to jellyfish. They are animals. But then inside of them there are these kind of rusty red spots. And these spots inside of here are different types of algae that give the coral its color. Like on this reef here, these pink and purple corals have those color algae growing inside of them. These darker brown corals have a different sort of algae living inside of them. In this case, we have the animals getting carbohydrates from the algae because, again, algae are photosynthetic. And as we know, animals can't make their own glucose, so they're going to get some of their carbohydrate from the algae. Meanwhile, the algae is getting a place to live, and it's also getting nitrogen waste from the animals. Animals, in this case, produce ammonia, And the algae find that to be a very suitable fertilizer, and it actually helps them to grow when they're growing inside the body of the coral. There's a lot more we could talk about here in terms of the importance of coral reefs and those ecosystems and kind of some of the threats that they're under right now, but for right now at least, we're not going to go too much farther into that. The third mutualism we're seeing is that of the lichen, and a lichen, again, is an association between a fungus and an algae. So when you see things like this growing on a rock or on a side of a building or on a tree, in the case of this sort of a plant over here, this is called old man's beard because it looks, well, like an old man's beard. Different types of lichens growing on trees, for example. In this case, we have now the fungus, which is kind of the crusty outer part here, providing a home for the algae, which lives inside the body of the fungus. So the algae gets a place to live on land, which is a place that algae typically don't get to live. If they're growing inside of a fungus, they are able to colonize terrestrial habitats, where otherwise they wouldn't be able to. The fungus, on the other hand, like we saw before, the fungus is getting carbohydrates from the algae because the algae is photosynthetic. So again, we have a win-win association here, what you would call a mutualism. Another type of mutualism involves ants. Actually, there's a lot of these out there. Ants are very frequently involved in mutualistic associations. In this case, we have ants tending to a group of aphids. These little kind of transparent oblong structures here are actually insects called aphids. This is a different species over here, but it shows you a little bit better. This aphid is actually giving birth to another aphid. Really kind of interesting reproductive biology that goes on there as well. But because of how aphids feed, they feed on plant sap, they feed on plant juices. What they'll do is they'll poke their snout down into the tissue of the plant and feed on basically sugar water. They get so much extra carbohydrate from that, they actually pump sugar water out of their back end. And of course, as you know, ants really like sweet things. They're going to find that to be attractive. And so the ants will come along, they'll find a group of aphids, they'll feed on that sugar water that they're secreting, but then the ants will also take care of the aphids. They'll protect them, they'll keep them out of harm's way, they'll chase away any predators that show up, because ants can be really, really effective, kind of voracious and aggressive species. They can fend off almost any herbivore, any predator in this case, and keep them away from the aphids. So again, we've got both parties here. The ants are getting food, and the aphids are getting defense from predators. We see ants forming associations with plants as well. This plant here is called a bullhorn acacia tree, and this is sort of a younger green shoot here, but you can see these large thorns that are being produced. In the background, there's an older one that's been produced. And so what these plants are doing is they're providing a home for the ants. These are hollow on the inside, and ants like to live inside of them. These kind of reddish structures on the leaves are actually food provided by the plants to the ants. And so what happens here is the ants will actually again, defend the plants. If a deer or something comes along to feed on the acacia tree, if it takes a bite of it, there's a really good chance it's going to get a mouthful of ants, and that's going to be a really bad experience. So the herbivore then would leave the plant alone. And then again, the ants, of course, get a place to live, and they get some food out of it as well. Pitcher plants. These are plants that grow in bogs and places where it's really hard to get nitrogen out of the soil. So what they do instead is they use the carnivorous aspects to gain nitrogen or protein. They trap insects, but every so often you'll get an insect that fall into one of these things. It's too big. It sort of clogs it up and makes it less efficient. There are ants that will come along and clean that out. So the ants are getting food. The pitcher plant is getting the larger indigestible material removed. Again, it's a mutualistic type of association. Now, with the acacia relationship, there's another kind of aspect to this, another dimension to this that has only recently been recognized. But what happens here is these ants that live on the acacia trees, if there are other tree species growing in the neighborhood, if they're in the close proximity to their host plant, what they will actually do is they will go out and they'll start clipping leaves off of the other plants. And so what they're doing is they're actually favoring the growth of their own host plant by giving it more sunlight, more water. They're decreasing competition for their home. So in that context, the ants would actually be more of a parasitic type of situation. They're not only clipping branches off the trees, they're also clipping flowers off the trees, which means those other surrounding competitor trees are not able to reproduce. And for that reason, they're favoring the survival and reproduction of their own host. So in that case, it would be more of an exploitation relationship, or almost more of like a parasitism or an herbivorous relationship where the ants are actually hurting these other trees in order to obtain some benefit for themselves. And in that case, it would be the added growth of their host tree. The next one we're going to look at is commensalism. And commensalism is where you have a plus neutral association. So as it turns out, commensalisms are very, very difficult to find in nature. Normally, if you see what looks to be a commensalistic relationship, chances are it's going to be one of the other types, mutualism or exploitation type of situation. But there's a few examples out there. Species that hitchhike, like barnacles, that will grow on a whale or on a sea turtle shell. If there's only one or two barnacles growing on that turtle shell, turtle's probably not going to notice it. It's not going to bother them. It's not going to slow it down. It's not going to hurt them. So the barnacle gets to move around, and the sea turtle really couldn't care less about the barnacle being there. So that would be a pretty clear-cut case of a commensalism. If there were a ton of barnacles, though, such that it actually hindered the turtle in its swimming, it creates a lot of drag and it's heavy, so the turtles have to spend more energy, then you'd be looking more of an exploitation relationship. This picture here, we have what are called epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. In this case, we have cypress trees growing, and hanging down from those cypress trees is a plant called Spanish moss, which incidentally is not a moss. It's actually related to pineapples, but it is called Spanish moss. Now, the cypress trees provide a place to attach, and they provide a home for the Spanish moss, so that the Spanish moss is benefited. The trees, on the other hand, aren't really affected either way. They're not harmed by the Spanish moss unless there's such a heavy growth of it that it causes the tree to snap off or something, which is pretty uncommon. And the cypress trees aren't really benefited by the presence of the Spanish moss either. So it's a win-neutral association. The moss gets a place to live. The trees really couldn't care less. This association here, we've got what are called cattle egrets. These are cattle egrets, these little birds here. And of course cattle, cows. And so in this situation, we have the cattle, the livestock that are walking around in the field, and as they move through the field, they stir up insects, grasshoppers and flies and things, and the cattle egrets are right there, and they eat the grasshoppers, and they get a really good meal just by hanging out with the cattle. Right? So the egrets are getting a benefit in terms of food, and the cows, I mean, they really couldn't care less if the egrets are there or not. The egrets aren't hurting them, they're not helping them, so again, that would be a pretty good case of a commensalism. If we go back and look at our other picture back here that I didn't talk about too much, all the way back at the beginning, right? This one. This is probably also a commensalism. So we have a clownfish here. Everybody knows clownfish from Finding Nemo, right? We also have an anemone over here. So anemones are related to corals and related to jellyfish and those kinds of things, hydras and those kinds of things as well. The clownfish live inside the body of the anemone, obviously getting a benefit from it. They're getting a home, they're getting a place to live, they also get some protection because the anemones can sometimes sting things that come in to try to disturb them. The clownfish very obviously get a benefit. The anemones really don't seem to be hurt or helped by the presence of the clownfish. The only way there might be a benefit to the anemone from the clownfish is if the clownfish kind of cleans out in and around the tentacles, thereby making them more efficient. And that apparently does happen at times. But for the most part, the clownfish-anemone association is probably more of a commensalism than anything else. All right, so we've got our clownfish and our anemones. We also have over here, this picture, this one gets a little bit more convoluted because we have this animal here is called an impala, just like the car, the Impala. In fact, if you look at the logo on the Impala, the car, you'll see a stylized version of this thing's head, actually the whole body, and sort of running. These birds here are called oxpeckers. And so what they do is they go around, they find cattle like this impala, and they look for parasites. You see down here on the leg, there are some ticks or some flies or something. These oxpeckers will come along, and they'll actually feed on the ticks that are on that animal's body, which is a benefit to both. Like both parties are getting a positive association. The impala is getting parasites removed, the oxpeckers are getting food, and so everybody wins. If the parasites aren't that abundant, though, you might not think the impala gets that big of a benefit. The birds are still getting a meal, but a small parasite load is not going to bother the animal, the impala, so it might be more of a commensalism in that case. Right? On the other hand, if there aren't any parasites around, these oxpeckers take on an entirely new persona, and so what they'll do, kind of like these two up here are doing, is they'll actually go up to the ears, they'll go up around the eyes, they'll find any sort of old scabbed over wounds, and they'll pick at them until they start to bleed. And then the oxpeckers actually feed on the blood from the impala. So in that context, it would be more of an exploitation relationship or parasitism than it would be anything else. The birds are getting a meal, and the impalas probably would prefer to not have their blood stolen or scabs picked away at her or whatever. All right, so we're going to cut off this section here, and I will start up the next section shortly with predation and parasitism, otherwise known as exploitation.